Brilliant, thank you. What a great transition from being perpetrators to being held accountable. And that's what justice is. Michael Hurley is a retired CIA officer and former member of the U.S. National Security Council, who has worked in the field, gathering evidence, assessing situations, analyzing, and assisting in creating plans to see to it that there shall be accountability in every single situation. Our theme in this session, Never Again Part 1, Modes of Direct Intervention, is all based upon the principle of accountability. Those in Nuremberg were only a few small examples of required accountability, but most of the perpetrators got away scot-free. Let us commit ourselves that in the future, we, in every single country, will see to it that the perpetrators of crimes, of human rights violations, of misdeeds, will be indeed held accountable, because unless they know they will be accountable, they will not stop. Please welcome Michael Hurley.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you today. I've enjoyed the excellent presentation so far, and I'm going to speak about pursuing war criminals in the Balkans and Al-Qaeda war criminals following the 9/11 attacks. I don't mean to compare in any way with the Holocaust. Nothing compares with that. But I do want to highlight some crimes against humanity that have happened in more recent times, in part because I have some specific personal knowledge of these things and even played a small role in it. But as we get started, so I'm a former CIA officer, and the last part of my career, the last 10 years or so, was dedicated to counterterrorism. And I think it's pertinent, especially at a conference of lawyers, to talk about authorities at the beginning. Where does its authority to pursue war criminals come from? I remember as a first-year law student in constitutional law, had a brilliant law professor named Fred Morrison who taught us that in examining a statute, examining any authority, you look at where it comes from. Did Congress actually have the power, the authority in the Constitution of the United States to pass that law? Where does it come from exactly? And I remember the big lesson we learned was that almost everything derives from the Interstate Commerce Clause, including civil rights legislation. So where does CIA's authority to pursue war criminals come from? It's not from the US Constitution. There was no CIA created at our nation's founding. It was created by the National Security Act of 1947. Today, CIA's general authority comes from federal statutes, specifically Title 50 of the US Code. I want to distinguish that from Title 10 of the US Code, which basically lays out the authorities of our armed forces. That's the statutory basis for that. Now, both CIA and the US military were operating in the Balkans during the Balkans Wars in the 1990s, and later in Afghanistan, and worldwide following the 9/11 attacks. Specific authority in each case, pursuing war criminals in the Balkans and pursuing Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda lieutenants in Afghanistan and other countries, came pursuant to separate presidential findings, often known as memoranda of notification. Just a word about presidential findings. They authorize CIA covert action very specifically. They're managed by the National Security Council. Just a word about what the National Security Council is. People often think of it like a place. It's actually a group of people in the United States defined by statute. The people are the President of the United States, the Vice President, the Attorney General, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Director of CIA, the Director of FBI, and others. These findings are briefed to our congressional leadership. In the United States, in the press, you'll often see references to the Gang of Eight in Congress. What is the Gang of Eight? The Gang of Eight consists of the Senate Majority Leader and the Minority Leader, and it consists of the Speaker of the House and the Minority Leader in the House, and the Chairman and Ranking Member of the two intelligence committees, one in the House and one in the Senate. I would recommend to you that any time there is a good book out about U.S. covert action, read it, because they will often disclose highly secret programs. Some of these in our past have failed, but some have been huge successes. I'd specifically recommend you read Chapter 4 of the 9/11 Commission report, which details the findings of the president that authorized the killing of Osama bin Laden. This was before the 9/11 attacks. And if you read that chapter 4, a large part was written by someone that worked for me on the 9/11 Commission, a Harvard PhD in history, Alexis Albion. It lays out in great detail the decision-making process that went into the decisions of the President of the United States, that there was a mortal enemy of the United States targeting United States interest in the world, and and killing was authorized at that point. So specific presidential findings for the CIA to pursue Balkans war criminals and Afghan war criminals. And I think it's important to bear that in mind. There's a legal basis for everything that the CIA has done. I'm not here to talk about enhanced interrogation today, but even that was done under the color of law. Very controversial, of course, for many good reasons. From the start of the Balkans wars of the 1990s, there were terrible war crimes committed, crimes against humanity, and investigations of genocide. You remember the coining of the odious euphemism ethnic cleansing that we learned about in the early 90s and the mid-90s. And these terrible things took place on a scale that we hadn't seen since World War II. Now, during that conflict and the kind of dissolution of the Balkans, uniquely and perhaps for the first time, much of what the leaders were saying, the encouragement of ethnic cleansing, the encouragement of war crimes, the encouragement of liquidation, of forcible removal of populations, was captured on TV live as the leaders of Serbia and of Croatia and of the divided parts of Bosnia made public appearances. This is fairly unique, so it created an actual video record that's quite extensive as they exhorted their ethnic followers to commit atrocities. Now, how did the West respond to this? The West responded by setting up the International Criminal Court for the former Yugoslavia, known by the acronym ICTY, and that was done in like 92 or 93, with judges and prosecutors drawn from around the world. NATO nations committed resources, personnel. Special forces from 6 countries participated in the hunt for the Balkans war criminals who had been identified and put on a list. In this hunt involved the biggest special operations deployment anywhere in the world before the 9/11 attacks. Agencies from many countries shared information and cooperated in the manhunt. The U.S. government and allies made capturing and bringing to justice war criminals a very high priority. Just to cite some specifics, the United States government has at the State Department an ambassador for looking into and investigating war crimes, staffed with an entire office. The Department of Justice had special investigations offices. The NSC staff itself, the National Security Council staff, always has a legal expert on war crimes working there. At the time I worked, my first stint on the National Security Council staff, where I was director for the Balkans, it was the late 90s. And interestingly enough, the person who had been selected to be the NSC senior director for war crimes was someone that I had known since childhood. We grew up in the same community. His name was David Whitman. He was then a distinguished professor of international law at Cornell and later became the provost at Cornell. And David was invited and served for 2 years on the NSC staff to head war crimes. And I remember during the Kosovo crisis, when Kosovar Albanians were put into boxcars, the first time we'd seen this since the Second World War as well, and removed from Kosovo and shoved into Macedonia, that David Whitman made a trip on behalf of the United States government with Elie Wiesel to go to these camps and to let the people know that the West was with them to support them. The Pentagon devoted armed forces, special operations forces, and forensic experts to the effort. Now, you'll recall some of the biggest names and the war criminals from those years. One was Slobodan Milosevic, the president of Serbia. The president of the Republika of Srpska, Radovan Karadzic. Ratko Mladic, who was commander of the Republika Srpska forces, and dozens of others. One was Biljana Plavšić, who was a president of the Serb Republic. Later on, she was indicted for war crimes, including creating impossible conditions of life, persecution, terror, ordering forcible deportations, etc. She was, when tried by the ICTY, sentenced to 11 years after she was found guilty, and ended up serving about 8 or 9 of those years in a Swedish prison. So what were the crimes that we're talking about? They included artillery shelling of civilian populations, mass murder, sanctioned mass rape, torture, wholesale slaughter of non-combatants, and forced removal of entire populations. So much of this was in the news. You remember what happened in Srebrenica in 1995, when 8,000 Bosnian men and boys were slaughtered, 8,000 of them. Terrible, terrible war crimes. So again, just to go over the authority to pursue Balkans war criminals, memoranda of notification in the case of the Balkans signed by President Bill Clinton authorized the CIA to capture Balkans war criminals to face justice at the ICTY in The Hague. What was the CIA's mission? To track down, arrest, and bring to court these people on the list of war criminals. I have just a few personal anecdotes I'd like to share because I had kind of a unique position during this period, actually 2 positions. One, I led CIA personnel on the ground in both Bosnia in 1995 during the war and in the first year of Dayton peace implementation in 1996. But then I think somewhat uniquely, I was also asked to serve on the National Security Council staff as director for the Balkans. So I had this perspective of both the policy side of what the United States was doing about war crimes and then on the ground, sort of what we call boots on the ground, actually pursuing war criminals. And I was directly involved in those operations in 95 and 96 in Bosnia and in Kosovo in 99 and 2000. Interesting is I recall when I first went out to the theater in Bosnia in 1995 while the war was still going on, I saw, at least for the first time in my life, although I'd heard about them, I saw the use of drones in action. They weren't armed then, they were just surveillance. But I remember going to an airfield controlled by the United States and seeing these sort of little planes taking off and being sort of struck and fascinated by them, and realizing now today, 20 years later, how important they become in counterterrorism efforts. After hostilities, after the Dayton Peace Accords in Bosnia and later in Kosovo, after the International Kosovo Force entered as peacekeepers, the war criminals, and there were some 161 on this list that the ICTY had, went dark. They went off the grid. They went into hiding because they knew they were going to be targeted, not just by the United States, but by NATO allies and principally 6 other countries. So how did you find war criminals? Well, the effort against these Balkan war criminals, because they went dark, because they went into hiding, took years. In intelligence, you develop sources, you talk to people, you go out and you try to find people that has intelligence on their location. In some cases, people volunteered information. In some cases, you paid them. We were doing all of this covertly. Once you had the location, and often this would come from intelligence sharing of different intelligence services, the United States worked very closely with the French, with the British intelligence and security services, with the German intelligence and security services as well. You would develop that information, and we would then bring in special teams, principally from the United States, but the British had their special teams there as well, and their job was to go out and capture these people. But it's a very difficult undertaking, and there's always an aversion, at least back then in the US military, to avoid loss of life or injury to their forces where at all possible. And sometimes that would lead to some risk aversion on the part of commanders. And I remember, as we targeted individuals for capture, having to supply the intelligence to the military to meet that level, that threshold level of what they called actionable intelligence that they would need and require before they would undertake an operation. What would that consist of? Well, you had to kind of know the location. You had to be able to tell them, and I would fill out maybe 30 pages of forms, literally, documenting, let's say the person was in a house. Where was the house? What were the points of access? Were there civilians in that area? Who was going to be in the house? Was family going to be in the house? What weapons might the person have on hand? Were they likely to resist? And so on and so forth. And that's the level of detail that was required before you could actually take that action and put people into harm's way, even people in our military. From the policy side, we had to come up with new strategies to find war criminals as time went on. So we came up with new ideas. And we did this, it wasn't just one person, it was a whole group of people working with our allies. We'd have video teleconferences daily with the British, for example, who were working on this, with the French as well. That was also a new thing by the mid-90s, or certainly by the early 90s, video teleconferences. The Pentagon had this ability and the CIA did. But coming up with rewards programs, literally bounties were put on the heads of the top people in the millions of dollars. And if people came forward with information that proved out, they would get paid that money. Ways to publicize this. How did you get the information out? Over radio, over TV, for example, just handing out flyers, all kinds of things. But I want to emphasize that while there were ups and downs throughout this process, there was a real dedication, at least that I saw, and commitment of the United States government and its principal allies to find these war criminals so that they would be brought to justice. And I think this is an enduring legacy of Nuremberg and what was established there, that you have to establish this principle and not just say it, but mean it and back it up, never again. And that people that exceed these limits, that they'll pay for what they do. And I can tell you, I know of at least 2 people personally who were asked to come back to serve on the NSC staff, and they agreed to do so. This is at the White House during the Bill Clinton administration, only after receiving promises from the highest level of the United States government and that administration that the administration was dedicated and would make pursuing war criminals in the Balkans one of its highest priorities. So did we get the Balkans war criminals? Well, in fact, we did. The pursuit itself was a historic achievement. It took a very long time, about 18 years, but by 2011, all 161 people on the ICTY list of indictees faced justice one way or another. Some were hunted down and captured, some through a number of different ruses that were used to find them. Some gave themselves up because they preferred to give themselves up to The Hague, the ICTY in The Hague, rather than have their door busted in, at 2 o'clock in the morning and be rousted from bed and trundled up to The Hague. The effort to bring them to justice was long, uneven, and mired with mistakes. It was very bumpy. And at times, the will of different powers, sort of there was politics involved between the United States, between the French, with the British, and the ICTY, and the chief prosecutors there. So there were ups and downs, and it didn't all go smoothly. But it ultimately emerged, and these are quotations that I have up here from a book by a British author, and I'll cite the book at the end of this talk. But it ultimately emerged as the most successful manhunt in history and an extraordinary testament to the tenacity of a remarkably small group of people. Karadzic, who was really at the top of the list, was captured in Belgrade, really on the outskirts of Belgrade. After years in hiding, he was wearing a disguise, and he'd been basically living as a kind of new age healer of some kind. I remember finding that kind of humorous. Mladic, the general of the Bosnian Serb army that committed terrible atrocities, was found as well in the country at his cousin's home, and he was old and destitute by the time he was founded. They tracked down a general of the Croatian army. The Spanish helped in this, and he was holed up in a luxury hotel in the Canary Islands. I think they found him in 2005. The last person found, the last of the 161 people on that list, was found in, I think it was July 2011, and he was Goran Hadzic, and he had, Hadzic was lured out because he had run out of money, and he somehow had gotten a hold of a forged copy of a Modigliani that he was sort of painting, that he was sort of claiming was authentic, and he was lured out, and on a ruse that they had buyers for that, and he needed money badly, and they captured him. He was the last one. So that's actually, you can kind of write, close to that chapter of the Balkans thing and of those tragedies. Now, just to turn to targeting war criminals in Afghanistan and around the world, really, post 9/11. On September 17th, 2001, so that's 6 days after the 9/11 attacks, President George W. Bush signed an order authorizing CIA to kill or capture al-Qaeda militants around the globe. These broad and exceptional authorities would give CIA the broadest and most lethal authority in its history. This broad grant, interestingly, is still in effect and forms the basis of CIA's counterterrorism efforts today, even as the threat of terrorism has shifted from al-Qaeda, which still exists but not probably as virulent as ISIS is today, for example. And there's a lot of criticism in the United States sort of saying there needs to be legislation passed that updates this now because it's a very broad grant of authority, and there's a legitimate legal discussion going on about whether we should still, that is, CIA should still be operating under an authority that was given in 2001 when the war on terrorism has changed so substantially. So what was it like pursuing war criminals in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and elsewhere? Again, I had both a policy side and a boots on the ground side because I led one of the first early teams of CIA personnel into Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks. But the first task when the U.S. government entered Afghanistan was to overthrow the Taliban government, which had been basically shielding al-Qaeda and giving them an area in which they could plan their operations. And I just want to point out that the Central Intelligence Agency had a team on the ground in Afghanistan within 2 weeks following the 9/11 attacks, which I still find extraordinary to this day, within 2 weeks on the ground in Afghanistan. And that was weeks before the United States military could get there, because CIA can be very, very nimble. They put very small teams in, linked them up with the Northern Alliance, who were in Afghanistan, who were assisting in the fight against the Taliban. And I should also say, for those of us that are older than a certain age, that the person who led the first team into Afghanistan, it was not me, I think mine was the 5th or 6th team in 3 or 4 weeks later, was a gentleman by the name of Gary Schroen. Gary Schroen was important because he'd been a chief of CIA station in Kabul He could speak Pashto and Dari. He had also served as chief of station of the CIA station in Pakistan. So he had intimate knowledge of Afghanistan, intimate knowledge of the players and all of that, which was exceedingly important. He was also 61 years old when he led that first team into Afghanistan, if you can imagine. But the government had to draw on that deep experience and the network of contacts that he had. Gary, interestingly enough, and just coincidentally, but 2 weeks before the 9/11 attacks, had turned in his retirement papers at the agency. It's a process you go through. You declare you're going to retire, and then you go off and have your nice retirement. 9/11 happened, and he got a phone call, and he went into the director of CIA's office, who said, "You know that those papers you turned in 2 weeks ago, we've lost them." So Gary's on the ground leading this team within 2 weeks of the 9/11 attacks. And he's written a book, by the way, which I actually don't cite in my recommended readings, which I should have, but it's called First In, an aptly named title, because he was the first into Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks, and it's well worth a read. First In by Gary Schroen. So the highest priority was to overthrow the Taliban, and then to pursue what were known as high-value targets. That's bin Laden, his deputy, the Egyptian physician Ayman al-Zawahiri, Mullah Omar, who had been the head of the leader of the Taliban. So our responsibility as teams inserted into different parts of Afghanistan was to develop intelligence on the location of these people for capture-kill operations. We worked with our military. Often our teams had special forces assigned to us. These were Green Berets who would then train friendly Afghan militias to assist us in the hunt. And you needed them because you needed their language capability and their area knowledge, et cetera, to do this work. We could call on special forces teams at Bagram Air Base outside of Kabul, where they always had on 24-hour standby some rather extraordinary operators, which I will explain in just a moment. So how did we do it? We developed sources on the ground. One of the difficulties, one of the problems is in intelligence, normally you might have a year or 2 years to develop a source of information and test that source's reliability. Can you confirm that they're being honest, that they have access to the information that they have? There was no time to do this in these kinds of circumstances. The time fuse was very, very short. So you always had to bear in mind that you couldn't take what people were telling you at face value. You always had to try to verify as best you could. We relied on cash quite often. We used cash to pay the friendly Afghans who were helping us and serving as military and protective forces. We relied on cash to pay informants. Literally, and I know this from personal experience, at the outpost I was at, every couple of weeks a helicopter would fly in duffel bags filled with $100 bills in the amounts of millions of dollars each time. And we would go through it very, very quickly, paying for what we needed out in that area. But over time, we developed the information we needed to try to find out where these people were that we were hunting. So just a little bit about who we were working with on this. It wasn't just CIA. I described some of Gary Schroen's incredible background, and he brought a lot of expertise, and others did as well, in terms of languages and area knowledge. But we teamed with the very best military forces in the United States government. And deployed with my team, for example, we had SEAL Team 6. Those are the hostage rescue people, but they have very great offensive capabilities. We had Delta Force, also hostage rescue in the United States. These are sort of legendary forces. British Special Air Service were with me. British Special Boat Service. Australian Special Air Service. We had to develop unconventional methods to get around. We had RVs, recreational vehicles flown in that Delta Force would use and the Navy SEALs would use. Some of us had to learn how to ride horses, to ride horseback, and even to ride camels in some of these very remote parts of Afghanistan. The CIA did not have the helicopters when the conflict began, and we got in there so quickly. And the helicopters we used had to operate at very high altitudes, because often we were in the Hindu Kush Mountains with altitudes up above 10,000 feet. And the choppers the US government had were not really capable. So what the agency did very quickly was buy a bunch of kind of Russian helicopters that had those capabilities, but there was always a little bit sketchy about whether you could really depend on them, overhauled them. And then they would fly, our pilots, CIA pilots would fly only at night wearing night vision goggles, navigating these mountain passes as they flew us into remote parts of Afghanistan. So some really unconventional capabilities were called upon. As I said, there were problems in trying to find this. It's like the reliability of information, dealing with people through a language that you didn't understand. We had very few people, actually, as it turned out, when the conflict began and when our intervention took place, that actually understood Pashto or Dari. And you have to then rely on locals whom you hire. And then you have questions of trust about them and difficulties of translation. But there was a high priority on finding bin Laden for over a period of years, of course. And for getting Zawahiri, there was a huge priority on him, the number 2. Just one example of Zawahiri and the pursuit of him, I remember getting some intelligence where an informant told us that Zawahiri had been injured in a bombing strike, and he was lying injured in a hospital about 60 kilometers from where my base was located. I didn't believe the intelligence. I thought the person that was sharing this with us was a fabricator, that was someone fabricating this information for money. I didn't trust them. Nevertheless, because there was the off chance that Zawahiri might be there and he was such a high-value target, I had to make the call up to Bagram Air Base outside of Kabul, who then dispatched a Special Operations Forces team that crashed in on this clinic, and lo and behold, Zawahiri was not there. He is still at large today. But we were doing this, of course, while a lot of other action was happening in Afghanistan. I was involved in what became known in winter of 2002, just 4 or 5 months after the 9/11 attacks, of Operation Anaconda, which captured the world's attention in February and March of 2002. It's a battle against the last redoubt of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And we had located a concentration of them, kind of hoping that some of the leaders were there. And this involved US air power and bombing then that went on for over 2 or 3 weeks. But on the first day of Operation Anaconda, and this fighting, I think, took place at the highest levels the US military has ever fought at. And this was around 9,000, 10,000 feet level. But on the very first day of the attack, tragically, the al-Qaeda enemy shot down a Navy SEAL helicopter. Actually, what happened was the Navy SEALs were engaged in a firefight on the ground at 9,000 or 10,000 feet in the mountains. One of their number was shot. When they got back to the helicopter to evacuate, they noticed they were missing one. Navy SEALs did not leave anyone behind. They went to search for him. And in searching for him, 7 of them were killed. 7 Navy SEALs in one day. And the word went back to the Pentagon right away, and Donald Rumsfeld, who was then Secretary of Defense, was of course, it was a great tragedy and up in arms because he thought it was an intelligence failure, that somehow the military had not been alerted that at this particular location that there could be such lethality to Navy SEALs who participated in it. And there was a shock that hit the Pentagon with that tragedy. And I remember the request came in where I was from my headquarters to advise headquarters what intelligence had been shared with the Pentagon prior to this action. And all I did was I wrote a responding one message back to headquarters, in which I listed all the referenced intelligence reports that had been put out in the previous 5 to 6 weeks before this engagement occurred. And I listed over 50 intelligence reports that said how many were up in the mountains, what weapons they had, that they would fight to the death, and so on and so forth. So that kind of ended any discussion that day of any possible intelligence failure on that issue. But the Navy SEALs were medevaced to the base that was our home base, and I went back there and actually assisted in some of the first aid given to those who had survived. So at least one culminating thing, in a sense, was the killing of bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan in May 2011. That's after a 10-year hunt for him. The Hollywood version of that operation, many of you may have seen the film Zero Dark 30. It's a drama. I think there are some elements of truth that are captured in it. It's probably worth seeing. As Hollywood goes, maybe better than most films, but it shows that operation in some detail. For those wishing to delve a bit deeper than Hollywood, there are a few books on my recommended reading list that are quite good. And John, this will be on the website, right, I guess, so you can go back to this. But the quotes that I was doing about the successful aspect of the manhunt for the Balkans war criminals come from a book called The Butcher's Trail: How the Search for Balkans War Criminals Became the World's Most Successful Manhunt by Julian Borger. And Mr. Borger spent the better part of 2 days interviewing me back before that book was published, and a lot of other people on the US side and British side that were directly involved in it. I'd also recommend the 9/11 Commission report, particularly Chapter 4, that gets into this whole question of manhunts and the presidential authorization for them. A really excellent book is called Ghost Wars: The Secret History of the CIA, Afghanistan, and bin Laden from the Soviet Invasion to September 10, 2001 by Steve Kahl, a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning author and a friend of mine. But that book is really excellent on how we got to 9/11. Steve, just a month ago, published a second book. I call it Ghost Wars 2. Its actual title is Directorate S, which tells the story about how the Pakistan Intelligence Service has actually been thwarting efforts in Afghanistan over the last 10 years. And that, too, is a book that's well worth reading. I'd also recommend The Finish: The Killing of Osama bin Laden by Mark Bowden. You know him as the author of Black Hawk Down. And another book called Manhunt: The 10-Year Search for bin Laden by Peter Bergen. Peter Bergen, incidentally, I believe is the last Western journalist to interview Osama bin Laden before the 9/11 attacks. There is a book called The Terror Presidency that gets into the whole issue, if you're interested in the enhanced interrogation question from a legal point of view, by Jack Goldsmith, who I believe is a law professor at Harvard Law School. And then lastly, and this is a book that I just read, and this is fiction, but as we know, sometimes fiction and literature can capture truths very well, is a book called Testimony by Scott Turow, who usually writes legal thrillers. And the law enters into this as well, because the book has to do with pursuing Balkans war criminals, and the plot is intricate and interesting and up to Scott Turow's usually high standard. Thank you so much.
Michael Hurley. Michael, you are a true patriot. We thank you.